Good evening and welcome to Sleepy Time History. Today we will take a look at one of the most pivotal battles of World War II, the Battle of Stalingrad. If you enjoy these narrations, please consider liking and subscribing for more content. If there is a historical event you'd wish to hear next, please consider leaving a comment. And now to the story. The Battle of Stalingrad, Death on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Stalingrad was one of the most brutal and pivotal battles in human history. It lasted from August 23, 1942 to February 2, 1943, and became the turning point in the Second World War's Eastern Front. What began as a lightning advance by Hitler's armies into the Soviet Union soon turned into a grinding, bloody war of attrition in the ruins of a city that bore the name of the Soviet leader himself, Joseph Stalin. This is the story of that battle, how it began, how it was fought, and how it ultimately shattered Hitler's dream of conquering the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, the road to Stalingrad. To understand the Battle of Stalingrad, we have to go back, almost a full year, to June 22, 1941. On that day, Nazi Germany launched the largest land invasion in human history, Operation Barbarossa. Over 3 million German soldiers, along with hundreds of thousands of troops from Axis allies, crossed the border into the Soviet Union, beginning a campaign of unprecedented scale and brutality. But why did Hitler invade the Soviet Union in the first place? The answer lies in a toxic blend of ideology, ambition, and strategic calculation. Adolf Hitler had long viewed the Soviet Union as Germany's ultimate enemy. In his book Mein Kampf, he outlined the concept of Lebensraum, living space. He believed that Germany needed to expand eastward into the vast lands of the USSR to provide room for the so-called Aryan race to flourish. In his eyes, the Slavic peoples were inferior. Communism to him was a Jewish conspiracy. Barbarossa was not just a military campaign, it was an ideological crusade. But there were practical reasons as well. Hitler wanted the vast natural resources of the Soviet Union, its oil, its grain, its minerals. He believed that conquering the USSR would cripple Britain's chances of survival and force it to surrender. And critically, he thought the Red Army would collapse quickly under pressure. After all, just 2 years earlier, Stalin had purged much of his officer corps, executing or imprisoning thousands of experienced commanders. And so, despite having signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin in 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Hitler prepared to betray it. As his generals drew up invasion plans, German propaganda painted the Soviet Union as a decaying, backward state. Many in the Nazi leadership believed that the campaign would last only a few months. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, the German invasion began. Without a declaration of war, the Wehrmacht smashed across an 1,800-mile front, stretching from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. 3 massive army groups were deployed. Army Group North, aimed at Leningrad. Army Group Center, headed for Moscow. And Army Group South, targeting Ukraine. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. Over 600,000 vehicles, 600,000 horses, and thousands of tanks and aircraft were mobilized. The Luftwaffe launched a preemptive strike, destroying thousands of Soviet aircraft on the ground. Within hours, entire Soviet divisions were being encircled. It was blitzkrieg at its peak, fast, coordinated, and devastating. The early weeks of Barbarossa were catastrophic for the Soviet Union. The Red Army was caught off guard, poorly led, and often outmaneuvered. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were surrounded and captured in huge encirclements. In the Battle of Bialystok-Minsk alone, over 300,000 Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner. Entire regions fell in a matter of days. Civilians suffered terribly. As German forces advanced, the Einsatzgruppen, mobile SS death squads, followed behind, carrying out mass executions of Jews, communists, and so-called undesirables. Barbarossa wasn't just a war. It was a campaign of racial and ideological extermination. Despite the crushing blows, the Soviet Union did not collapse. Stalin, caught off guard by the invasion, disappeared from public view for several days. But when he re-emerged, he gave a series of rousing speeches, calling on the Soviet people to resist. Factories were evacuated to the east. A scorched earth policy was declared. Anything of value that could not be defended was to be destroyed. Still, the German advance continued. Army Group North pushed toward Leningrad. Army Group Center advanced rapidly toward Moscow. And Army Group South swept into Ukraine, aiming for the prize city of Kyiv. The Wehrmacht's logistics were strained, but the Red Army seemed to be on the brink of destruction. By late summer, the Germans had penetrated deep into Soviet territory, but cracks were beginning to show. The roads were poor, and the infrastructure couldn't handle the needs of a modern mechanized army. Fuel and ammunition had to be trucked in over huge distances. The weather, hot and dusty, choked engines and slowed progress. Yet, Hitler believed victory was close. At this critical point, a major strategic decision changed the course of the campaign, and arguably, the war itself. Originally, the plan was for Army Group Center to strike directly at Moscow, but Hitler diverted key panzer divisions southward to assist in encircling Kyiv and securing Ukraine. The result was one of the largest encirclements in history. Over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were captured in what Hitler called the greatest victory in military history. But the delay proved costly. By the time the Germans resumed their push toward Moscow in October, the infamous Russian autumn, the Rasputitsa, or mud season, had begun. Rain turned roads into rivers of mud. Vehicles sank. Horses died. Supply lines broke down. Then, the temperatures dropped. The German army had not prepared for winter. Their troops lacked proper clothing. Engines froze. Lubricants turned to jelly. Weapons malfunctioned. As the Wehrmacht neared Moscow's suburbs, the Red Army, now reinforced and reorganized, launched a massive counter-offensive. Siberian divisions, trained and equipped for winter warfare, struck with brutal force. For the first time, the German advance was halted. Worse, the Wehrmacht was pushed back from the gates of Moscow. It was a shocking reversal. The war that was supposed to last a few months had turned into a quagmire. The Eastern Front was now a war of attrition. Yet Hitler refused to retreat. He issued his infamous "Stand Fast" orders. German soldiers were to hold their ground, no matter the cost. Cities became frozen battlegrounds. The losses were enormous on both sides. The Red Army lost more men in 1941 than the United States would lose in the entire war. Despite their heavy losses, the Soviets had one key advantage: depth. They could retreat hundreds of miles and still keep fighting. Their factories had been moved east, beyond the reach of German bombers. And unlike Germany, the Soviet Union could draw on a vast reserve of manpower. What they lacked in equipment and training, they made up for in numbers, determination, and sacrifice. As 1941 came to a close, the German leadership faced a grim reality. The Soviet Union had not collapsed. Moscow had not fallen. Winter had arrived, and German forces were exhausted. Still, Hitler remained convinced that victory was within reach. In the spring of 1942, the German High Command debated the next steps. Some generals argued for a renewed push toward Moscow, but Hitler overruled them. He shifted focus south to the Caucasus oil fields. That meant securing southern Russia and the Volga River. That meant capturing Stalingrad. This new plan would lead to the launch of Case Blue, the 1942 summer offensive. The initial assault on Stalingrad, firestorm on the Volga. By late summer 1942, German forces had pushed deep into southern Russia. The Wehrmacht's Army Group South had advanced hundreds of miles as part of Case Blue. The summer offensive meant to capture the oil-rich Caucasus region. But to secure their flank, protect vital supply routes, and deliver a symbolic blow to Soviet morale, Hitler set his sights on one key city, Stalingrad. Stalingrad was a sprawling industrial hub along the western bank of the Volga River. Named after Joseph Stalin himself, the city held strategic and symbolic significance. It was a major transport route for Soviet oil and grain, but more than that, its name carried immense weight. For Hitler, taking Stalingrad was a chance to humiliate Stalin. For Stalin, holding it was a matter of national pride and political necessity. The German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, was tasked with taking the city. Accompanied by elements of the 4th Panzer Army, they approached the city from the west in August 1942. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe, led by General Wolfram von Richthofen, prepared to launch one of the most intense bombing campaigns of the war. On August 23, 1942, the assault on Stalingrad began, not with a ground invasion, but with fire from the sky. The Luftwaffe unleashed a massive aerial bombardment, dropping over 1,000 tons of bombs on the city in a single day. Entire districts were obliterated. The city's wooden buildings erupted in flames. Brick structures crumbled under the shock waves. Civilians, caught unprepared, were killed in the thousands. Survivors fled to the river, only to be strafed by German planes. By nightfall, Stalingrad was burning. The sky glowed orange, thick with smoke and ash. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Yet, ironically, this devastation would later work against the Germans. Their plan had been to sweep into the city quickly, using tanks and mobile infantry. But the rubble-filled streets made tanks almost useless. What was supposed to be a swift conquest turned into a brutal urban grind. As Paulus's forces approached, the Soviet 62nd Army, under the command of General Vasily Chuikov, began digging in. Chuikov had only recently taken command. His orders from Stalin were brutally simple: not a step back. The Soviet High Command had issued Order Number 227, threatening execution for any soldier who retreated without orders. Stalingrad was to be held at all costs. Zhukov knew he couldn't match the Germans in firepower or equipment, but he had the terrain, and he would use it. He ordered his troops to embrace close-quarters combat, to eliminate the advantage of German artillery and air support. The strategy was called hugging the enemy. Soviet forces would stay so close to the Germans that calling in support fire became impossible without hitting their own men. By early September, German ground troops reached the city's edge. Fighting erupted in the suburbs and outlying districts. The Germans encountered stiff resistance almost immediately. Soviet snipers, anti-tank teams, and fortified buildings turned every block into a battleground. The city, now little more than ruins, became a perfect environment for defensive warfare. The Germans were frustrated. Their blitzkrieg tactics, so effective in open terrain, didn't work in the rubble of Stalingrad. Tanks couldn't maneuver. Streets were blocked by collapsed buildings. The Soviets had created an urban maze filled with traps and ambushes. Still, the Germans pressed forward. They focused on three key areas: the northern industrial district, the central city, and the southern suburbs near the Tsaritsa Gorge. Progress was slow and costly. German units would take a building one day, only to lose it the next. Assault groups advanced floor by floor, room by room. In some buildings, Soviets and Germans occupied different floors and fought each other through walls and ceilings. One of the most symbolic locations in the early fighting was Pavlov's house. This ordinary apartment building was defended by a small group of Soviet soldiers led by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov. They fortified it with machine guns, anti-tank rifles, and barbed wire. For nearly 2 months, they held off repeated German attacks. From the German perspective, taking Pavlov's house required nearly as many resources as it would have taken to conquer an entire city block. The building became a symbol of Soviet resistance. Elsewhere, the Mamayev Kurgan, a large hill overlooking the city, became a focal point of the fighting. Control of the hill meant control of much of the city. It changed hands multiple times during the initial assault, with each side paying a heavy price. The soil became soaked with blood and filled with shrapnel. Later, soldiers would claim that after a rainstorm, the hill would turn red from the blood that had seeped into the earth. The Germans relied heavily on their elite infantry units, including combat engineers and specialized urban warfare teams. These troops carried flamethrowers, grenades, and submachine guns. They had to clear every room of every building, often finding booby traps or ambushes. The Soviets, meanwhile, rotated fresh troops across the Volga River every night under cover of darkness. Boats were shelled constantly by German artillery, but the flow of reinforcements never stopped. The Volga itself became a front line. Soviet supply and reinforcement efforts had to cross the river, often under enemy fire. Barges, rafts, and small boats carried troops, ammunition, and food across the wide river under the cover of smoke and night. Many were sunk. Soldiers who fell into the freezing water often drowned or died from hypothermia. But the lifeline held, and the Soviets maintained a constant, if thin, presence in the city. One of the key aspects of the early assault was the role of snipers. The ruined city was a perfect hunting ground. Debris, shattered walls, and broken buildings provided endless hiding spots. Among the Soviet snipers, one name became legendary: Vasily Zaitsev. From the rooftops and rubble, Zaitsev and others picked off German officers, machine gunners, and engineers. Their kills sowed fear and confusion. German snipers were deployed in response, leading to deadly duels in the shadows. As the battle intensified through September and into October, the front lines became meaningless. The Germans occupied 80 to 90% of the city, but they couldn't root out the last pockets of resistance. Soviet soldiers fought from basements, tunnels, and sewer systems. Supply dumps and command posts were hidden in the ruins. The defenders became ghosts, silent by day, deadly by night. The Luftwaffe continued to pound the city, but their effectiveness diminished. They had destroyed Stalingrad, but in doing so, they created a fortress of debris for the defenders. The bombed-out shell of a city turned into a Soviet stronghold. By mid-October, the Germans had captured most of the southern part of the city and were slowly moving into the north. Factories like the Red October Steel Works, the Barricadi Arms Factory, and the Dzerzhinsky Tractor Plant became frontline combat zones. Workers continued to manufacture weapons even as the buildings were shelled. In some cases, weapons were handed directly from the assembly line to soldiers fighting in the same building. The conditions for soldiers on both sides were beyond inhuman. The stench of death was everywhere. The ruins were filled with corpses. Flies swarmed over unburied bodies. Food was scarce. Water was polluted or frozen. Medical care was nearly non-existent. The wounded often lay where they fell, untreated, and died slowly. German and Soviet soldiers lived in basements, cellars, and makeshift bunkers. They suffered from lice, frostbite, and exhaustion. Shell shock was common. Sleep was rare. Morale on both sides teetered constantly between desperation and grim determination. And yet, despite everything, the fighting never stopped. The initial assault on Stalingrad was supposed to be quick. It became a slow, grinding war of attrition. What began as a plan to take a city turned into a meat grinder that consumed entire divisions. The Germans continued to push forward, but their advance had slowed to a crawl. Every inch gained came at a horrific price. By November 1942, Paulus believed he was close to final victory. The Soviet forces were battered, and German troops were entrenched in most of the city. But what the Germans didn't know was that the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, was preparing a massive counter-offensive. The city had become the bait in a trap. The initial assault on Stalingrad had turned into one of the most brutal urban battles in world history. But the worst was still to come. Operation Uranus. The trap closes and the battle ends. By mid-November 1942, the German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, had captured nearly all of Stalingrad. Block by block, factory by factory, the Wehrmacht had clawed its way through the devastated city. Only scattered pockets of Soviet resistance remained across the Volga. From the German perspective, final victory was near, but appearances were deceiving. Behind the scenes, the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, was planning something massive. While German attention remained focused on grinding down the last Soviet defenders in Stalingrad, the Red Army was quietly building up strength far beyond the city's borders. This buildup was for Operation Uranus, the counter-offensive designed to encircle and crush the German forces at Stalingrad. The concept was simple, but bold. Instead of attacking directly into the heavily fortified center of the German lines, the Soviets would strike at the weaker flanks, held not by elite German troops, but by under-equipped Axis allies, the Romanians, the Hungarians, and the Italians. These satellite armies were stretched thin, poorly armed for winter combat, and ill-prepared for a major assault. On the Soviet side, the operation was orchestrated by Generals Georgy Zhukov, Alexander Vasilevsky, and Nikolai Vatutin. Their strategy called for two massive pincer movements, one from the north and one from the south. These would meet west of Stalingrad, trapping the Sixth Army and its supporting units in a giant pocket, what the Germans called a kessel or cauldron. On November 19th, 1942, Operation Uranus was launched. At 7:30 a.m., in the frozen stillness of the Russian steppe, over 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces opened fire in a thunderous barrage. The northern assault smashed into the Romanian Third Army, positioned along the Don River. The Romanian lines collapsed quickly. Many units were surrounded, overrun, or fled in disarray. The next day, November 20th, the southern pincer struck the Romanian Fourth Army, again with overwhelming force. The Soviet tanks and infantry cut through the poorly defended lines, moving swiftly toward their objective. Within 4 days, the two pincers met at the town of Kalach, west of Stalingrad. The encirclement was complete. Over 300,000 Axis troops, including the German Sixth Army, parts of the Fourth Panzer Army, and remnants of Romanian, Hungarian, and Croatian units, were now trapped inside a frozen hell with dwindling supplies and no clear path to escape. Hitler's dream of capturing Stalingrad had just turned into a nightmare. The Germans were stunned. General Paulus, now cut off from reinforcements, requested permission to break out to the west. He knew the situation was dire. His fuel was running out. Ammunition stocks were low. Winter had arrived, and the encircled army had no adequate shelter, clothing, or medical care. But Hitler refused. He ordered Paulus to hold his ground and await a relief operation. Hitler believed the encircled troops could be supplied by air until a rescue force could reach them. This belief would prove to be catastrophic. The Luftwaffe, already overstretched and operating at the edge of its range, was tasked with delivering at least 500 tons of supplies per day to the encircled Sixth Army. In reality, it managed far less, often less than 100 tons per day, and sometimes just a few dozen. Harsh weather, Soviet fighters, and poor airfields made resupply almost impossible. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated quickly. Temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Celsius. Soldiers froze in the open or in poorly heated shelters. Frostbite and disease spread rapidly. Ammunition was rationed. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Medical supplies ran out. Wounded soldiers lay untreated. Morale plummeted. Outside the encirclement, the Germans attempted a relief operation, Operation Winter Storm, in December 1942. Led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the offensive pushed from the southwest and briefly threatened to reach the pocket. But Paulus was never given the order to break out and link up with Manstein. Hitler still clung to the fantasy that the Sixth Army could hold out. Without cooperation from inside the pocket, the relief force was too weak to succeed. it was repelled by Soviet counterattacks and forced to withdraw. The chance to save the Sixth Army was lost. Meanwhile, the Soviets tightened the noose. In late December and early January, they launched Operation Little Saturn, striking at the Italian Eighth Army and further destabilizing the Axis Southern Front. The Red Army was now in full control of the battlefield. Back inside the encirclement, Paulus and his men faced the inevitable. The Sixth Army had become a starving, freezing shell of itself. Entire divisions had ceased to function. Communication broke down. There were no more reinforcements, no more supplies, only death and desperation. Yet Hitler refused to accept reality. On January 10th, 1943, the Soviets launched Operation Ring, the final phase to crush the trapped forces in Stalingrad. Over 7,000 artillery pieces, along with tanks and infantry, attacked the perimeter of the German pocket. Soviet troops advanced steadily, despite heavy resistance. German units, already at the breaking point, began to surrender or collapse. By January 22nd, Paulus again requested permission to surrender. Hitler responded by promoting him to Field Marshal, a calculated insult. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler expected Paulus to either fight to the death or take his own life, but Paulus did neither. On January 31st, Soviet troops reached the command post of the Sixth Army's southern group. Paulus, gaunt and exhausted, surrendered. The northern group of encircled troops, cut off and still fighting, held out for 2 more days. On February 2nd, 1943, the last organized German resistance in Stalingrad ended. The battle was over. The cost was staggering. Germany and its Axis allies lost over 800,000 men killed, wounded, missing, or captured. The Soviet Union suffered even more, over 1 million casualties, including civilians and military personnel. Stalingrad, once a city of 400,000, was a smoldering ruin. Entire districts had been wiped from the map. Of the 91,000 German troops taken prisoner at the end of the battle, fewer than 6,000 would ever return home. The rest died in captivity, of disease, starvation, exposure, or exhaustion. But beyond the numbers, Stalingrad was a turning point. It marked the end of Hitler's expansionist ambitions in the East. The German army, once seen as invincible, had suffered a humiliating and irreversible defeat. The aura of Nazi superiority was shattered. For the first time, the Red Army had not only stopped the Wehrmacht, but destroyed a major German field force. The psychological effect was enormous. Across the world, the Allies saw that the tide had turned. In the Soviet Union, morale soared. The victory was used as a powerful symbol of resistance and sacrifice. Stalin, once reeling from the German invasion, emerged as a wartime leader of mythic status. Streets, songs, and monuments would forever immortalize the battle. For Germany, the defeat at Stalingrad marked the beginning of a long retreat. The Eastern Front would never again see a major German offensive on the same scale. From this point on, the Red Army would push westward, through Ukraine, through Poland, and eventually into Berlin itself. And yet Stalingrad was more than a military defeat. It was a symbol of total war, a fight to the death between 2 ideologies, 2 empires, and 2 visions of the world. The battle showcased the extremes of human endurance and cruelty. It was fought in cellars, in factories, in sewers. It was fought by snipers and sappers, by tanks and knives, by men frozen in the snow, and by civilians trapped beneath rubble. It was a battle where there was no safe place. In the end, Stalingrad became not just a turning point in World War II, it became a legend, a moment where history itself pivoted. And though the city would rise again, rebuilt from the ashes, its name would forever be etched into the story of war, endurance, and sacrifice. The significance of the Battle of Stalingrad, turning the tide of a global war. The Battle of Stalingrad was more than just a brutal confrontation between two armies. It was a defining moment of the Second World War, a fulcrum on which the entire conflict turned. When the last shots were fired and the last pockets of resistance surrendered in February 1943, something far greater than a city had been won or lost. The strategic, psychological, and symbolic significance of Stalingrad cannot be overstated. Let's begin with the strategic impact. When Operation Barbarossa was launched in June 1941, Nazi Germany's goal was clear: the swift and total destruction of the Soviet Union. Hitler envisioned a lightning campaign, one that would crush Soviet resistance, seize vast resources, and eliminate Bolshevism as a threat. And for a time, it seemed possible. But by the winter of 1942-43, the German dream of dominating the East had collapsed. Stalingrad marked the first major, irreversible defeat of the German army. Over 800,000 Axis troops were killed, wounded, or captured. An entire German field army, the Sixth Army, was obliterated. The Germans had spent vast amounts of men, material, and time on the Eastern Front, especially at Stalingrad. With the failure of the campaign, their offensive capability in the East was crippled. From this point on, Germany would fight a defensive war in the Soviet Union, constantly retreating, ceding ground with every passing month. For the Soviet Union, the victory at Stalingrad was a turning point of immense consequence. After the trauma of the initial German invasion, the fall of Kiev, the siege of Leningrad, and the threat to Moscow, Stalingrad marked the beginning of a sustained counter-offensive. It proved to the Soviet people and to the world that the Red Army could not only defend, but also destroy the best that Germany could throw at them. In the months and years that followed, Soviet forces pushed westward, retaking Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and eventually marching all the way to Berlin. The strategic initiative on the Eastern Front had shifted permanently. Next, we have to understand the psychological impact of the battle. For Nazi Germany, Stalingrad shattered the myth of invincibility. Up until that point, the Wehrmacht had been seen as unstoppable. Blitzkrieg had swept through Poland, France, and the Balkans. Even in the Soviet Union, the Germans had advanced thousands of kilometers, inflicting staggering losses. But at Stalingrad, the invincibility narrative cracked and then broke. The psychological blow rippled through the German military, the Nazi leadership, and the German population. Propaganda no longer matched the reality. Families began receiving notifications of missing or captured loved ones. Public confidence in the war effort was shaken. For the first time, the possibility of defeat became real. For the Allies, Britain, the United States, and others, Stalingrad was a sign of hope. It showed that the Axis powers could be defeated. It gave weight to the idea that victory in Europe was possible, even if it came at a horrific cost. Winston Churchill described the Soviet stand at Stalingrad as glorious. American newspapers heralded the Red Army's victory. The global perception of the war changed almost overnight. In the Soviet Union, the battle was elevated to near mythic status. Stalingrad became a symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and national pride. The victory was not just military, it was emotional and ideological. The people of the Soviet Union had endured famine, repression, and invasion. But at Stalingrad, they stood and won. The story of the battle was used by Stalin's regime to rally the country, to fuel wartime production, and to reinforce the narrative of a united people defeating fascism. And then there's the symbolic significance, which may be the most powerful of all. The battle was fought in a city named after the Soviet leader himself, Stalingrad. For Hitler, taking the city was a way to humiliate Stalin and crush Soviet morale. For Stalin, defending it became personal. The city came to embody the larger struggle between fascism and communism, between totalitarian empires, and ultimately between oppression and survival. Stalingrad was the battleground for two opposing ideologies. Every ruined building, every frozen trench, every bombed-out street became part of that greater confrontation. The intensity and savagery of the fighting, men killing each other with knives and entrenching tools over rooms and stairwells, was not just a reflection of desperation. It was a representation of the larger war's totality. Total war. That's what Stalingrad became. Civilians were caught in the crossfire with nowhere to run. Entire families lived and died in basements beneath the rubble. Workers at weapons factories kept producing arms while German shells fell around them. Supply boats crossed the Volga under fire to keep the defenders alive. Snipers, tanks, aircraft, and infantry fought simultaneously in a single square kilometer. The battle also exposed the limits of Hitler's leadership. His refusal to allow the Sixth Army to retreat, despite clear warnings and the pleas of his generals, revealed a dangerous inflexibility. His obsession with symbolic victories overrode sound military judgment. That failure in judgment would cost Germany dearly, not just at Stalingrad, but for the rest of the war. On a global scale, Stalingrad influenced diplomacy and alliance building. It encouraged greater coordination between the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom. It helped solidify the Allied grand strategy for the war in Europe. It increased pressure for a second front in the West. What would eventually become the D-Day invasion of Normandy in 1944. And it reshaped the post-war world. The Soviet Union emerged from the war as a superpower, and its central role in defeating Nazi Germany gave it enormous credibility, particularly in Eastern Europe, where it would later establish its sphere of influence. Stalingrad became a cornerstone of Soviet identity during the Cold War. It was cited as proof of Soviet strength, unity, and the righteousness of its cause. Even today, the name Stalingrad carries a weight few battles do. It represents not just victory or defeat, but endurance. sacrifice, brutality, survival. It is a reminder of what happens when entire societies are mobilized for total war, when politics, ideology, and race are used to justify unimaginable violence, when ordinary people are thrust into the heart of a conflict they did not choose. And so, the significance of Stalingrad lies in its legacy. It was the beginning of Nazi Germany's fall. It was the rebirth of the Red Army. It was the point where the Eastern Front began moving west and never looked back. It was a graveyard of soldiers and civilians alike, but also a monument to resistance. The ruins of the city were rebuilt, and the city was renamed Volgograd in 1961. But the memory of Stalingrad, the battle, the suffering, the turning point, lives on. It is studied in military academies. It is remembered in memorials. And it is told in stories, because Stalingrad was more than a city. It was the place where history changed course. Even today, the story of Stalingrad serves as a reminder of the horrors of war and the resilience of those who endure it. It was a tragedy on an unimaginable scale, but also a turning point that helped decide the fate of the modern world. Thank you for listening to this episode of Sleepy Time History.